My subject, or our subject for discussion, is NATO and European Union, values and interests concerning the Western Balkans. I want to deal with five subjects, briefly. The role of values for NATO and the European Union, values and interests and the connection between the two, the opposing powers, Russia and China, conflicts inside EU and NATO, and fifth, a joint approach or national orientation, or what could only also say transactional or transformational policies. To the first point, NATO and EU, the role of values. Both NATO and the European Union have been founded on the basis of values. You can find them in the Atlantic Charter and the North Atlantic Treaty, but especially, of course, in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. These documents define these principles. For example, the right of people to choose their governments, representative democracy, freedom of expression, individual liberty, impartial rule of law, minority rights, and so on. In reality, all these values are more and more contested and even violated. Inside NATO, for example, by Turkey, but also recently by the US, the example for that challenge and backsliding. Concerning the European Union, it's predominantly Hungary and Poland, who are also members of NATO, who are examples for grave concern. Now, my conclusion to the first point would be that NATO and even more the European Union are more than interest-based organizations. They are based on values. Unfortunately, some countries with growing tendencies are challenging and violating these principles. Nevertheless, the founding values and principles are guidelines for the collective policies of NATO and European Union. Now to my second point, values and interests. Values and interests are often interconnected. Sometimes interests are hiding behind publicly offered values. Overall, there is a tendency visible, especially now at the United States, to put economic and even personal presidential interest on top of the foreign policy agenda. With some euphemism, one can call it transactional policy, where only the result, especially result for the president of the US, the deal, is important. Inside the European Union, the promotion of interests are used to underline very often national identity and also domestic political gains. Sometimes there's a special importance given to very restrictive Christian values in contradiction to the openness and libertarian values embedded in the Charter of the European Union. Now, my conclusion would be that the values are the more important, the more they are linked and connected with interests. And especially the European Union should make clear that it has an interest to have close ties with the Balkan countries, to have them on the way to join the European Union, but on the basis of the values or the principles of the European, especially the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Third point, the differences with Russia and China. Looking to the political development in Russia and China and to their specific foreign security policy, one can see many differences between Russia and China on the one hand, NATO and European on the other hand. That's not only concerning the values and principles, but also the actual foreign policy. Russia, especially with President Putin, has partly not accepted the new borders after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. In the case of Georgia, Moldavia, Ukraine, maybe also now Belarus, you can see that attitude. Russia is in addition supporting authoritarian regimes and not really interested in democratic development. China is a bit different. It is not showing the same pattern of foreign policy, but rather using more economic instruments to strengthen their interest, at least in Europe. Concerning the South China Sea, also military power is used to expand China's interest and eventually perhaps or even territory. So my conclusion to that point would be, in spite of deviances from the values and principles and therefore some backsliding inside the West, European Union and NATO, there are fundamental differences to Russia's and China's domestic and external policies. The extension of influence and power and the support for authoritarian regimes also in the Balkans, are in opposition to the principal policies of the European Union and also of NATO. But to oppose these policies of Russia and China should by no means mean to prevent an invitation to Russia and China to be involved into building a common peace structure also in Europe at large. The policy of decoupling promoted especially now by President US and the present administration is in effect endangering the collective responsibility for our common world. Now to my fourth point, the weakening of NATO and EU due to internal disputes. The role of EU and NATO to give clear answers to the defaults but also aspirations of the Balkan country is connected also with the internal disputes. This concerns the basic democratic principles inside the EU, but also national antagonism inside NATO. The most up-to-date example is the political, maybe even military fight between Turkey and Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. My conclusion is, it is always a mistake to leave open questions unresolved. Instead of putting all the efforts to solve the Cyprus issue and to use gas exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean to establish regional cooperation, EU and NATO left these questions open and did not try at least to establish a new regional cooperative order. Therefore, there should be a common effort for NATO and EU to solve the current issues from Kosovo to Bosnia-Herzegovina and not leave these questions and issues open. The last issue I want to deal with is, of course, the question if there should be rather a joint approach or more national orientation, or one could say, what's the advantage or disadvantage of a transactional approach versus the transformational policies. Now, in general, it seems that today national and even sometimes nationalistic policies, often promoted by authoritarian governments, are overtaking cooperative and collective endeavors. But these national and mostly bilateral efforts for conflict resolution have many limits. Recently, we could see that with the example of the US intervention to the Kosovo-Serbian conflict and the conference the US was organizing in Washington. The result, if you read the documents, concerns more Israel and the question of recognition of Israel or the recognition of Kosovo than the regional dispute between Kosovo and Serbia. So my conclusion would be, in spite of the rise of interest-based, transactional and bilateral political efforts by several governments, for example, the United States of America, collective and community-based policies have more and long-term effective results. For example, the stability gained for Europe after the Second World War and the transformation of Europe into a region of peace, cooperation, and respect for human rights was only possible through establishing a European Union and through the foundation of policy based on cooperation and of mutual respect. And also the military alliance, one has to confess, between the European Union and US helped in that way. So out of this reason, cooperation between the European Union and NATO, even if we have increasing difference with the US under President Trump, would be very necessary. So yes, the results of such policies cannot be shown always very in short term, but in the long term, I think that this cooperative, collective way to deal with politics is much better, and therefore also for the Balkans, to have a stronger tie with the European Union on the one hand, but also with NATO, would be helping the transformation of the Balkans also in a peaceful region and the respect for human rights.